Story 1. The shelter that someone else maintained. I had been volunteering as a trail maintainer in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for nearly 4 years when I first encountered that shelter. Most of my work involved repairing backcountry structures, clearing fallen branches, and fixing eroded trails. I usually enjoyed the solitude. Being alone in the forest gave me time to think and breathe away from the noise of the world. That autumn morning was assigned to a remote shelter tucked deep along a rarely used ridge trail. The directions were straightforward, but the ranger had added a quiet warning. It hasn't seen maintenance in years. I packed my usual gear, tools, spare wood, food, and water, and set out early, eager for a long day of hiking in the crisp mountain air. The trailhead started at a narrow, winding forest road. Fog hung low over the trees, making the pines look like they were floating in a gray sea. My boots crunched over damp leaves as I began the long ascent. The smell of wet soil, moss, and fallen leaves filled the air. Birds chirped occasionally, and a distant woodpecker drummed somewhere further up the ridge. Everything seemed calm, perfectly normal, until I reached the side path leading to the shelter. It was narrower, overgrown, and darker than the main trail, but I welcomed the challenge. The further I walked, the heavier the forest felt. Trees crowded the narrow path, their branches forming tunnels of shadow overhead. Thick fog swirled around my ankles as I stepped over roots and rocks, and the quiet made every snap of a twig echo. I paused frequently to catch my breath, glancing back down the trail. No one was behind me, of course, but the fog made it feel like someone or something could be following. My pack felt heavier than usual, even though I had carried it hundreds of miles before. Something about the stillness of that forest was different, almost expectant, as if it had been waiting for me. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, I arrived at the clearing where the shelter stood. At first glance, it seemed normal, but details didn't fit. The roof was straight and solid, the wood siding cared for, and the platform free of debris. That wasn't unusual for a maintained shelter, but the ranger's record showed no one had been here for years. I dropped my pack and walked around, inspecting the ground. It had been swept clean, and even the fire pit was arranged neatly, with stones stacked and ash removed. Someone had clearly been here, but who and why remained a mystery. I climbed onto the platform to inspect the interior. Sleeping surface was swept free of leaves, pine needles, and other debris that normally accumulate. Against one wall, a small stack of split firewood was carefully arranged under the overhang. Whoever had prepared it had thought about the next visitor, someone who might come and need a fire. I ran my hand over the smooth wood, wondering who had carried it deep into the backcountry. Hauling supplies this far is hard work, and I couldn't imagine a random hiker doing it without leaving some sign. I unpacked my tools, ready to do the inspection and repairs, but everything seemed in excellent condition. The boards on the roof were intact, the supports solid, and the steps leading to the platform were newer than the rest. Tapping the wood with my hammer, it sounded almost hollow, as if freshly repaired. I checked for signs of animals, but the floor was clean. Normally, unattended shelters show wear from raccoons or deer, but this one had been meticulously maintained. There was no record of any official maintenance, yet it looked like someone had been very deliberate. As the afternoon fog thickened, I decided to stay the night. Hiking back in darkness along the overgrown trail would have been risky. I set up my small stove for dinner and watched the mist curl around the trees. It gave the forest an unreal, dreamlike quality. Even the usual creaks and groans of the forest seemed quieter, almost hesitant, as if waiting. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar shadows. Hours passed, and I settled into my sleeping bag on the platform. That's when I first heard it. A slow, soft tapping against the shelter wall. At first I told myself it was just the wind moving a branch, but the forest was still. The tapping had a rhythm, deliberate, stopping briefly when I paused, then resuming. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my headlamp and scanned the outside, but the fog was thick. The silence that followed was heavier than the mist itself, pressing in on me from all sides. I stayed awake for hours after that first sound. Each time I drifted off, the tapping returned, sometimes from a different section of the wall. I checked the perimeter carefully, stepping into the fog with my light, but no footprints appeared. Even the firewood pile seemed untouched since my inspection hours ago. It was as if someone had been there but vanished completely, leaving the shelter prepared for me alone. The thought sent chills down my spine, but I tried to reason it away. Maybe a hiker had been discreet and gone before nightfall. Around midnight, the tapping stopped, replaced by a slow scraping along the roof. I froze, straining my ears. The sound was deliberate, unlike any animal I had heard in the backcountry. I shined the lamp upward, catching glimpses of mist rolling across the shingles, but nothing moved. My mind raced through possibilities. Raccoon, wind, branch, but none fit. The rhythm and timing suggested awareness, not instinct. Whoever or whatever was responsible seemed to move with intention, adjusting when I shifted or glanced. I stayed upright for hours, watching the fog swirl. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement beyond the clearing, soft footfalls or rustling leaves, but the forest remained empty. The sense of being observed grew heavier, and I kept the flashlight on. The wood felt unnaturally solid beneath my hands, the air cold and thick. Somewhere deep in the mountains, it felt as if someone else had been waiting for me, watching me without showing themselves. Dawn finally broke with a pale gray light over the ridge. Fog had thinned slightly, and forest sounds returned. Birds, a running creek, squirrels chattering somewhere unseen. Standing outside the shelter, I could see the trees clearly. The clearing was empty, neat, and orderly, exactly as I found it. I walked slowly around the shelter, examining steps, firewood, and platform boards, all exactly as I had left them. Whoever repaired and maintained the place remained a mystery. I made breakfast while thinking about the night. My instincts told me the shelter had been prepared intentionally for someone's arrival, yet no one was here and no record existed of recent work. The experience felt like stepping into someone else's world, meticulously organized and completely empty. Even as I ate, the tension lingered, hanging in the foggy morning air. I couldn't shake the memory of the tapping and scraping, though rational explanation seemed impossible. After packing my gear, I took one last walk around the clearing. The fog had lifted, revealing leaves and a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. Nothing unusual appeared, but the memory of the night stayed with me. Every small forest sound drew my attention, making me hyper-aware of each movement. I couldn't explain the meticulous condition of the shelter or the noises I heard. Even rational thoughts faltered in the heavy stillness of the Smokies. By mid-morning, I began the long hike back down the ridge. Each step on the trail felt heavier, burdened by the mystery I couldn't solve. I glanced back at the clearing, half expecting to see someone or something watching me leave, and nothing appeared. The shelter remained silent, pristine, and empty, as if the forest had swallowed any evidence of its caretaker. Even after reaching the main road and distant human sounds, the memory of that foggy ridge stayed with me. I told myself it had to be a deer moving parallel to the trail, but the longer I listened, the more that explanation felt weak. Deer do not match human pace with such exact rhythm, and they certainly do not pause precisely when a person pauses. Yet every time I slowed or stopped, the steps adjusted within a second or two, never perfectly instant, but always close enough to suggest awareness rather than instinct. My pulse quickened, and the forest around me seemed impossibly still, as if holding its breath. I gripped my walking stick tighter and strained to see through the dim fog, every shadow on the trail suddenly sharper than it had any right to be. I decided to step off the trail and crouch behind a large fallen log, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was following. The fog wrapped itself around me, dampening the world into muted shades of gray. My ears were painfully alert to every subtle sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, my own breathing echoing in the empty forest. The footsteps continued, deliberate and slow, moving alongside the trail but never veering closer or further away. It was the uncanny timing that terrified me the most. Someone or something was consciously tracking my pace, aware of my position even in the fog. I thought about calling out, hoping a human voice might reveal a lost hiker or a fellow trail maintainer. My throat tightened, and my voice sounded small and fragile when I finally whispered a greeting into the mist. The footsteps stopped instantly. A strange, heavy silence filled the clearing around me, as if the entire forest had pressed closer to listen. I waited, frozen, feeling the weight of every tree and rock around me. Seconds dragged into minutes, the silence almost unbearable, before the sound started again, this time fading slightly as it receded into the fog. I forced myself to stand and move forward, hugging the trail's edge and keeping my head low. Each step felt measured, as if the earth itself were guiding me, matching the rhythm of the phantom following. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of moss-covered boulders and twisted roots that had to be navigated carefully. My heart thumped painfully against my ribs, and I imagined what could be moving so precisely alongside me. A bear. Unlikely, given the careful timing. Human. Even less likely considering the shelter was remote, and no one had been reported on this trail for months. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as I continued along the trail. Every now and then, I would glance behind, catching only the fog and dark silhouettes of trees. The forest felt alive in a way it never had before, watching me, waiting. I remembered my map and compass, but both felt useless in the oppressive fog. I tried to focus on the simple task of moving forward, step by step, but the feeling of being followed was relentless. Even the faintest sound of the wind through the pines sounded like whispered voices, deliberate and probing. At one point, I stumbled over a root and cursed under my breath. The footsteps paused immediately, mirroring my sudden stillness. I froze, holding my breath, the hairs on my neck standing upright. After a few heartbeats, the sound resumed, matching my pace again. That was when I realized this wasn't an animal or random coincidence. The entity, whatever it was, possessed an intelligence, an awareness of my movements that made every instinct scream danger. I gripped my stick like a weapon, though I knew it wouldn't help against something unseen and calculating. I tried to pick up the pace, hoping to lose it along a switchback that wound steeply down the ridge. My legs burned, lungs aching, but the sound stayed behind me, unwavering. It was as if the fog itself had gained form, trailing me without faltering. I glanced around desperately, looking for a hiding place, a boulder, anything to shield me. Every option felt inadequate. The trees and fog seemed endless, a labyrinth designed to keep me trapped. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. I had been in the backcountry countless times, but never had I felt this utterly helpless. Eventually, I reached a small creek, cutting across the trail. I crouched beside it, water gurgling quietly as I tried to think clearly. The footsteps slowed slightly as they crossed the shallow water, but never disappeared. Something about the sound chilled me deeper than the fog or cold ever could. It was deliberate, patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. I wanted to turn, to run back the way I had come, but I knew the ridge trail behind me offered no cover and nothing to hide behind. I was forced to keep moving forward, every step calculated and slow. By late morning, the fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of the surrounding mountains. Sunlight touched the ridges, scattering patches of gold and brown across the forest floor. Despite the light, the presence behind me never fully vanished. The forest looked ordinary, calm, even beautiful. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I was still being watched, followed by eyes I could not see. Every shadow, every hollow between trees, seemed to pulse with hidden life. My usual confidence as a hiker had dissolved entirely, leaving only primal awareness. Survive, move, don't falter. I reached a small campsite along the trail, evidence of hikers from weeks prior. The clearing offered temporary comfort. Human traces and fire rings suggested safety. I paused to drink water and adjust my pack, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing appeared. The sense of intelligence behind the footsteps persisted, but at least now I had room to maneuver, and the open space allowed me to spot anyone or anything that might be lingering. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me as I rested briefly, wary of every sound. Moving on, I began to descend into a denser section of the forest. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, shadows stretching like hands across the trail. Each step required more effort as roots and rocks crowded the path, forcing careful navigation. Yet through it all, the rhythmic steps continued, keeping pace just beyond my vision. I realized that even in open spaces, I could not shake it. The entity did not need to be seen to exert its presence. It had become a weight pressing against my mind as much as the pack on my back. Finally, I glimpsed a familiar marker, a sign indicating the junction with a larger trail that would lead me back toward the trailhead. Relief surged through me. I quickened my pace, and for the first time the footsteps seemed to hesitate. The rhythm faltered, uneven for just a moment, then resumed once I slowed at the junction. I didn't stop. My mind was fixed on the main trail. every nerve straining for the moment when I could be free of the ridge and the fog that had concealed whatever had followed me. As I emerged onto the main trail, the forest around me returned to its usual sounds: rustling leaves, distant birdsong, the faint rush of a creek somewhere below. The footsteps vanished completely, as if they had never existed. Looked back at the ridge, mist curling gently over the trees, and tried to reconcile what had happened. Everything appeared normal again, almost mundane, yet I could not convince myself that I had imagined it. The shelter, the fog, and the rhythmic pursuit remained etched into my memory. By the time I reached the parking area and saw signs of civilization cars, voices, and other hikers, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The ridge trail and that shelter seemed like a different world altogether, one that existed outside the normal rules of time and space. I told the rangers about the shelter, about the meticulously maintained condition, and the strange tapping and footsteps, but they could offer no explanation. According to their records, no one had been there in years, and certainly no one had been following me along the trail. Even now, years later, I remember that ridge clearly. The shelter still stands on the map, inviting hikers to rest, yet the fog and the echo of those footsteps linger in my mind. I never discovered who or what maintained the place, nor did I find any signs of a human presence on that night. It remains one of the strangest experiences I've had in the backcountry, a perfect mix of solitude, skill, and something I can't explain. Every time I think of it, I feel that same quiet weight of the forest watching, waiting, keeping its secrets in the Smokies. Story 2. The Cabin in the Mist. I had hiked the Smokies countless times, but I had always avoided the lesser-known ridges above Deep Creek. That morning, eager for solitude, I decided to take an unmarked trail that I had only studied on a faded map. Mist clung to the forest floor like a living blanket, curling around ancient oaks and rhododendron thickets. I packed light but carried my essentials, telling myself that a solo hike could be refreshing. The forest seemed inviting at first, the quiet only punctuated by the distant rush of a stream, yet an underlying tension seemed to ripple through the mist. The trail started steep, winding past gnarled roots and moss-covered boulders. Each step required careful placement, and the sound of my boots against wet leaves echoed faintly, as if amplified by the thick fog. Birds occasionally broke the silence, but their calls felt muted, distant, like reminders of a world slightly out of reach. The deeper I went, the more the sunlight failed to penetrate the dense canopy. Shadows merged with mist, and the familiar forest I thought I knew became strange and alien, hinting that I had entered a place that did not exist on ordinary maps. After an hour of careful hiking, I emerged into a small clearing where an old cabin rose from the fog. Its logs were darkened with age, and smoke curled gently from the chimney, though no footprints led to the door. The structure seemed perfectly preserved, yet oddly out of place, nestled among towering tulip poplars and clusters of mountain laurel. My curiosity outweighed caution, and I approached, calling softly, "Hello." My voice returned only as a faint echo, swallowed by the mist. I could feel that this cabin was aware of me, waiting, patient, and deliberate. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and faint smoke. Dust coated the shelves, but a cot in the corner looked recently used. Kettle rested on a small stove, its handle polished and clean. Everything was arranged with meticulous care, yet no living soul was visible. I told myself someone must have stayed here recently, but the lack of footprints outside unsettled me. The space was silent, yet it felt alive, as if the cabin itself listened to my movements. I could sense intelligence behind the stillness, something deliberate, observing me without revealing itself. I explored cautiously, touching the cot and the rough table, noting the careful order of firewood stacked by the hearth. The windows reflected only gray mist, yet I felt eyes tracking my every motion. I told myself it was only nerves, but every instinct screamed otherwise. The cabin was not merely a shelter. It was a presence, patient and aware, its silence more alarming than any sound. Each breath I took felt measured, each step amplified by the attention that seemed to seep from the very walls. As the afternoon waned, I built a small fire, the flames sputtering as they caught the dry wood. The warmth brought temporary comfort, but my eyes remained fixed on the windows. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of timber outside, made my pulse spike. The fog thickened, wrapping the clearing in an unnatural hush. I felt the forest itself was watching, the cabin its sentinel. Each shadow seemed to shift with intent, and I began to understand that my presence had not gone unnoticed. By dusk, the first sound of tapping echoed from the cabin window. Tap, pause, tap. The rhythm was deliberate. My stomach clenched. I crouched near the fire, peering through the glass. Shadows moved just beyond the mist, vanishing whenever I focused on them directly. The tapping paused whenever I stilled, only to resume moments later. Whoever or whatever was out there was aware of me. The forest had become alien, the cabin its quiet ambassador. The footsteps began after nightfall, circling the cabin with careful precision. They were slow, deliberate, and impossible to locate exactly. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, a ranger, or an animal. But the measured rhythm and adaptive pauses made human or animal explanations implausible. I gripped my backpack tighter, feeling the uncanny synchronization between my movements and the unseen observer. The forest had become both a labyrinth and a stage for something intelligent, patient, and unseen. I dared not sleep. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, distant creak, wind in the trees felt charged, deliberate. Shadows flickered in the fog, subtle and alive. Hours passed with nothing tangible appearing, but the tension remained absolute. Each pause in the footsteps felt like a test. Each movement was counted. My own heartbeat became a metronome, measured against the intelligence I could not see. The cabin and its watcher had claimed me fully. Midnight approached, and the fog thickened, curling around the cabin like smoke. I crouched near the hearth, trying to focus on the mundane, the rough wood of the table, the scent of pine, the faint warmth of the fire, yet every memory of tapping, footsteps, and awareness returned with sharper clarity. The cabin was not ordinary. It had been arranged for observation, a patient presence waiting for someone to notice its subtle intelligence. Fear was secondary to fascination, a tension that refused to release me. Dawn arrived, diffusing light through the mist. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. No footprints, no signs of human activity, yet the forest felt charged, every leaf and branch alive with latent observation. The cabin remained hidden among the trees, silent and pristine, yet its presence lingered. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the memory of the previous night, but the forest's subtle intelligence pressed on me, patient and deliberate, impossible to ignore. I packed slowly, each motion deliberate, conscious of every sound. Even stepping onto the trail felt risky. The fog hung in patches, and the woods seemed to respond to me. My mind reeled from the previous night's encounter. Footsteps had followed my pace. Tapping had punctuated my every movement, and the cabin had waited, silent and aware. Rational explanations failed under the weight of the experience. The ridge had claimed a portion of my attention, and it refused to release it. I descended carefully, noting roots, rocks, and subtle changes in the fog. Every crunch beneath my boots reminded me of the cabin's intelligence. The forest was ordinary in appearance, yet I felt as though every tree, boulder, and leaf was aware of me. I imagined the cabin tucked in the mist above, meticulous and deliberate, observing without being seen. The sensation of being watched remained heavy, an invisible weight pressing at my shoulders. Sunlight broke through occasional openings, highlighting the valley below. Relief should have accompanied the view, yet unease persisted. The memory of footsteps and tapping, precise and deliberate, haunted me. The forest seemed alive in ways beyond understanding, and I knew that the cabin had left its imprint, invisible yet undeniable. I walked on with care, aware that the ridge's presence extended far beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. I reached a small clearing near the base of the ridge, where the trail widened slightly and sunlight filtered through the canopy, scattering golden patches across the damp forest floor. My legs ached, and my breath came in steady bursts, but the feeling of being watched refused to ease. I rested against a moss-covered boulder, scanning the mist-shrouded trees for any sign of movement. The fog swirled in strange, deliberate patterns, curling around roots and rocks as if the forest itself were breathing. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, tightened the tension in my chest, reminding me that the cabin's presence had not vanished. Its quiet awareness lingered in the woods, patient and unrelenting. I resumed my careful descent, every footfall measured, every sound around me amplified in the quiet forest. The fog hung in patches, curling around the roots and boulders, and the trees seemed to lean slightly as if observing. I could still feel the cabin's presence in my chest, an invisible weight pressing on my awareness. The rhythm of footsteps from the previous night replayed in my mind, matching my own in memory, if not in reality. Every step along the mossy trail felt like an act of negotiation with a patient, intelligent force that had watched me since I first set foot on the ridge. The trail narrowed again, twisting past rhododendron thickets and jagged rocks. My heart jumped at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, though no movement appeared. I reminded myself that the forest was alive in the usual sense, but the sensation of deliberate observation lingered, persistent and unnerving. I kept my eyes on the trail, counting roots and rocks as if mapping them could anchor me back to reality. Yet the cabin, hidden somewhere above, seemed to pulse with quiet awareness, as though the forest itself had been waiting for someone to notice its intelligence. A small creek crossed the trail, its icy water rushing over smooth stones. I knelt to drink, the sound loud in the stillness. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement in the water. A shimmer just beneath the surface, but it was gone before I could focus. My pulse raced as I stood, and I glanced toward the ridge. The cabin's memory pressed on me, more present than any physical structure could be. Every detail, the stacked firewood, the cot, the faint smoke, the silence, reminded me that the cabin had been organized with intent, its observer precise and patient. Sunlight broke sporadically through the dense canopy, illuminating patches of the forest floor. Normally, such beauty would have reassured me, but instead it emphasized how alien the ridge had felt. I imagined the cabin in the mist above, silent, meticulous, and aware. Every step I took seemed to echo its presence, and I realized that my encounter was not merely with the cabin but with the forest itself. Tuned to respond to my actions, rational explanations failed to quiet the tension that gripped me, as though Hemlock Ridge had imposed its own rules, invisible yet absolute. I rounded a bend where the trail widened slightly, revealing glimpses of the valley below. Mist curled around distant treetops, and shadows danced with the morning light. Relief should have come with the familiar landscape, yet unease persisted. The footsteps and tapping, precise and deliberate, replayed in my mind, and I could almost feel them synchronizing with my movements. The ridge, the fog, and the cabin's presence had left an imprint on the forest itself. Subtle but undeniable, shaping my awareness and forcing me to move carefully, deliberately, with full attention. The trail curved sharply, roots twisting across my path, and I navigated each step with heightened focus. The memory of the night inside the cabin haunted me, a pattern of observation and patience I could not dismiss. The forest seemed alive beyond the ordinary, every shadow a potential witness, every rustle a message. I realized that the ridge had been both sanctuary and test, and that the cabin had been its deliberate ambassador, a guardian of quiet intelligence that measured me with precision and patience. Hours passed, and the trail led me closer to the main park paths, where distant voices began to echo faintly through the trees. I kept my pace steady, but my mind remained alert, replaying every detail from the cabin. The stacked firewood, the cot, the meticulous interior, and the silent observation, all were reminders that some corners of the Smokies operate beyond ordinary understanding. The forest had been deliberate, patient, and observant, and I had been both participant and witness to its quiet intelligence. As I neared a small clearing near the junction, sunlight filtered through in gentle beams, illuminating moss-covered stones and scattered leaves. Birds called, and the ordinary forest returned to my senses. I observed hikers passing by, laughing and talking, entirely unaware of the ridge's secrets. Their presence was grounding, yet the memory of the cabin lingered heavily. I understood that my encounter had been unique, a glimpse of the Smokies as a living, conscious environment, capable of attention, calculation, and quiet patience. Continuing toward the junction, I found relief in the widening trail, though tension still clung to my shoulders. Every step reminded me of the cabin's intelligence, and of the deliberate presence that had tracked me with patience. The fog and shadows may have lifted, but their echoes remained, a subtle pressure on my mind. I thought of leaving entirely, but a part of me understood that Hemlock Ridge and its cabin were meant to impress, teach, and leave a memory of quiet vigilance. At a small overlook, I paused to take in the valley, feeling both awe and lingering unease. The ridge below seemed calm now, yet I knew its secret had not disappeared. The tapping, the footsteps, the careful observation, these were imprinted on my mind as strongly as any physical scar. I realized then that some experiences in the forest are permanent, lessons in awareness, patience, and humility, and that the Smokies contain places that exist to be noticed, measured, and respected. As I walked the final stretch toward the main trailhead, the ridge's memory clung to me like a shadow. Roots and rocks required my attention, but my mind replayed each detail from the cabin, the cot, firewood, faint smoke, and precise observation. The experience had shifted something in me. The forest itself had been active, patient, and aware, and I had been conscious of it in ways that exceeded ordinary perception. The ridge's presence lingered even as the sounds of civilization returned. Finally, I reached the edge of the park, where cars and voices signaled the ordinary world. Relief washed over me, yet I remained acutely aware of the ridge behind me. Hemlock Ridge, with its fog, cabin, and quiet intelligence, had claimed a piece of my attention and would not release it. Every lesson of patience, observation, and awareness remained vivid in my mind. I realized that the forest's subtle power and the cabin's meticulous care had left me changed. I sat briefly on a bench near the parking area, trying to relax and steady my legs. The ridge appeared calm in the distance, bathed in late afternoon sunlight. Yet the memory of that night, the tapping, the footsteps, and the attentive presence remained vivid, impossible to dismiss. Hemlock Ridge had not been hostile, but deliberate. Its quiet vigilance had taught me lessons I could never forget about patience, awareness, and the intelligence hidden in the Smokies. Driving away, I kept glancing back through the rearview mirror. The ridge seemed ordinary now, yet I knew it had been anything but. The cabin's presence, the careful observation, and the fog had left an indelible mark on my consciousness. No one else would see what I had experienced, and that was part of the ridge's design, patient, unseen, and deliberate. Hemlock Ridge had changed the way I would walk in the forest forever. Even years later, I remember the ridge, the cabin, and the intelligence that had followed me. The Great Smoky Mountains remain alive, patient, and deliberate. Hemlock Ridge had revealed that some places in the wilderness operate beyond human understanding, teaching lessons in vigilance and respect. I never returned, but the memory of that night endures, a permanent echo of the forest's quiet, watchful power. Story 3. The Hiker Who Vanished. I had planned the hike for weeks, aiming for a trail that wound through a western ridge near Klingman's Dome. Early autumn had draped the Smokies in fiery reds and golds, the air crisp and fragrant with damp leaves. I preferred solitude, and the thought of wandering an old, less-traveled path excited me. Birds called in distant bursts, squirrels darted across roots, and the smell of wet earth rose with the morning mist. Everything felt ordinary, yet there was a subtle tension in the quiet that I couldn't place. The trail quickly narrowed, roots and rocks forcing careful footing. Each step I took seemed louder than it should, snapping twigs and rustling leaves in unnatural echo. The deeper I ventured, the denser the mist became, curling between trees and diffusing sunlight into pale, ghostly gold. I told myself it was just the forest, but instinct tightened in my chest, warning me that something unseen watched, deliberate and patient. My boots pressed against mossy ground as if each step might be counted by an invisible presence. An hour in, I stumbled across a backpack, half hidden under leaves and debris. My pulse spiked. There was no one around, no footprints except my own. The pack was intact, weathered, but undisturbed, straps fastened as if waiting for someone to claim it. I approached cautiously, scanning the mist-shrouded trees. No one appeared. A gnawing unease settled over me. Had someone been here, lost or afraid? Or had the forest itself placed it, a subtle warning for those who wander too far? Continuing, I kept the pack in sight. The trail climbed, roots and rocks forcing constant attention. A subtle rustle behind me caught my ears, but when I turned, nothing moved. My mind raced, imagining animals, other hikers, or the simple settling of the woods, but the feeling of deliberate observation persisted. It was impossible to ignore. The forest felt alive, conscious, as though each tree and boulder were tuned to register my presence, watching silently, measuring each step. A faint whistling drifted on the damp air. Stop. Pause. Resuming. I froze, straining to locate it. The sound wasn't constant. It paused when I paused and resumed with each step. Not wind, not birds, not rustling leaves. It had intent. My pulse quickened. My skin prickled. The forest itself seemed aware, responding subtly to movement. Each glance behind me reminded me that I might not be entirely alone, and that the ridge was a place where observation was patient and precise. I pressed forward, trying to rationalize what I felt. Roots twisted underfoot, branches scratched at my sleeves, and the fog thickened, curling in unnatural patterns around trees and rocks. When I looked back, the backpack I had seen earlier was gone, though I had not left it. Unease coiled tight in my chest. The forest, I realized, had been deliberate in its impression, and something had followed him, or perhaps been waiting for me from the first steps along the ridge. A small clearing appeared, sunlight breaking faintly through the mist. I froze as I spotted a figure seated on the ground. Initially, I thought it was a resting hiker, but the stillness was unnatural. The figure did not shift as birds landed nearby or squirrels scurried past. Heart pounding, I crouched closer, calling softly. There was no response. The man or boy was pale, eyes wide but unfocused, seated perfectly still. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Something in the forest had taken hold of him. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder lightly. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Panic bubbled up. I checked the surrounding trees, scanning the mist. Everything was silent, yet I could feel the presence in the forest, patient, observing. I rifled through his backpack, finding a crumpled map, notes about wandering off the main trail, and an account of feeling watched by something unseen. My pulse spiked. He had walked the same trail I had, and now the forest's subtle vigilance had intertwined us. I decided to guide him back. His movements were stiff, mechanical, yet precise. Each step matched the rhythm of the forest, as if it had instructed him without revealing itself. I supported him along the trail, each root and rock a potential hazard, each sound amplified by the mist. It became clear that the forest was attentive, measuring our motions with patience. Every instinct screamed caution, but leaving him would have been impossible. The Smokies had marked him first, and now he was tethered to that quiet observation. Mist thickened as we descended, curling around tree trunks and boulders. I could sense eyes tracking us from above, though the ridge was empty to my vision. Shadows moved in subtle, impossible ways, twisting and lingering where sunlight failed to reach. The man's gaze lifted intermittently, following invisible patterns. My rational mind failed to account for the precision, yet I could not deny the forest's deliberate presence, the sense that every step had been observed, measured, and remembered. The trail leveled near a small creek. I stopped briefly to drink and rest, scanning the mist. Shadows lingered unusually, the leaves shivered without wind. Birds called faintly in the distance, and the man's breathing steadied, though his eyes remained haunted. Flicking towards subtle movements only, he seemed to notice. I understood then that this encounter had been intentional. The forest's quiet intelligence had claimed him first, and now my awareness was inseparable from it. By midday, patches of sunlight illuminated the mossy trail. We rounded a bend and saw hikers ahead, ordinary voices and laughter restoring some sense of normalcy. The man did not respond, his attention locked on the forest's hidden movements. I tried to reassure him, guiding him toward the ranger station nearby, feeling the subtle vigilance that had shadowed him now, pressing on me. The ridge's presence had not dissipated. It had left its mark, patient, deliberate, and quietly intelligent. A small bridge crossed a rushing stream. The man stumbled slightly, and I steadied him. Sunlight glinted off rocks, but the mist swirled unnaturally above the water. I felt the forest measuring us, aware of every step. I realized that this encounter had been more than coincidence. It had been an exacting lesson in awareness, patience, and attention. The ridge itself had been deliberate in its vigilance, shaping both him and me with invisible hands. Finally, the main trail came into view. Relief should have washed over me, yet tension lingered. The man's gaze flicked constantly toward shadows, mist curling like silent fingers. I understood that he carried the forest imprint now, and so did I. Every movement, every cautious step, was measured by the ridge's quiet intelligence. Even ordinary hikers on the trail could not perceive the lingering presence. But we both had felt it, and it would not be forgotten. We reached a small clearing near the trailhead. The man leaned against a tree, exhausted, his breathing steady, but eyes haunted. Sunlight dappled the forest floor. Ordinary hikers passed, laughing, unaware. I stepped back, taking in the ridge above, its mist curling faintly in the breeze. The forest had been patient, precise, and invisible, leaving its mark on anyone who ventured too far. Though the danger had passed, the memory lingered, a quiet reminder that the Smokies have secrets, deliberate and permanent, for those who wander beyond the familiar paths. We moved cautiously down the widening trail, the mist thinning as sunlight filtered through the canopy. The man remained silent, his gaze darting to subtle movements among the trees, as if the forest whispered only to him. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made him stiffen, precise in his actions, almost mechanical. I gripped his arm firmly, urging him forward, trying to keep both of us grounded in reality. The ridge above still seemed alive, patient and watchful, a presence I could sense but could not see. Roots twisted beneath our feet, and occasional sunlight illuminated moss and scattered leaves in vivid detail. I noticed the man's shallow, irregular breathing and the distant flicker of fear in his eyes. Something in the Smokies had followed him off the old overgrown trail, an intelligence that measured movements, paused when we paused, and tested patience. Rational thought told me it was merely the forest, but instinct screamed otherwise. Every step made me aware that the ridge had left its mark, subtle and deliberate. We reached a small creek where the water rushed over rocks. I knelt briefly, letting him steady himself, and glimpsed shadows curling in the mist above the surface, lingering far longer than natural. His pale face and distant gaze confirmed my unease. The forest's influence was tangible. Every rustle, every curling mist seemed intentional, as if the trees themselves had guided his movements, shaping his awareness. The Smokies had not released him. They had imprinted a part of themselves onto him, and I could feel it too. By mid-afternoon, the trail widened, and distant voices reached us. Ordinary hikers unaware of what had happened on the overgrown path. The man did not respond. His attention remained fixed on shifts in the mist. I spoke softly, encouraging him, reminding him of the ranger station nearby. Even in the sunlight and ordinary sounds, attention lingered, subtle yet undeniable. The forest had taught him a lesson, quiet and patient, leaving traces of awareness that would not vanish easily. We paused at a small overlook, sunlight illuminating the valley below. The man leaned against a boulder, exhausted, breathing unevenly. I scanned the distant ridge, now bright and calm, yet the memory of mist and deliberate observation lingered. Leaves swirled unnaturally in patches, shadows twisted in impossible patterns. And I understood that the forest's quiet intelligence had followed us, shaping perception without revealing itself. The Smokies were more than scenery, were deliberate, attentive, and patient. The final stretch of trail approached, roots and rocks demanding careful steps. I could feel the ridge's presence, patient and exacting, pressing subtly against the back of my mind. The man walked with stiff precision, almost robotic at times, yet I could sense his awareness slowly returning to him. The forest had measured him, tested patience, and left its imprint, leaving no part of him untouched by the experience. I realized that even leaving the ridge physically would not free us entirely from its quiet vigilance. Sunlight streamed in stronger now, scattering shadows and revealing familiar trail markers. Hikers passed by, their chatter grounding me in reality, yet my pulse remained elevated. I glanced at the man. His eyes still flicked toward the trees, every motion cautious. The forest had claimed a piece of his perception, subtle but permanent. I understood that some corners of the Smokies operate beyond human comprehension, patient and aware, observing anyone who strays too far from the beaten path. A ranger station appeared at the trailhead and relief washed over me. The man collapsed onto a bench, finally letting his weight settle, exhausted but stable. I sat beside him, heart pounding, listening to ordinary voices and footsteps in contrast to the forest's lingering presence. The ridge above seemed calm, sunlit and serene, yet I knew the mist, shadows, and deliberate observation had left a permanent mark on both of us. The Smokies had taught their lessons subtly but unmistakably. The forest observes, measures, and remembers. The ranger approached, concern on his face. I explained briefly, trying to convey the unnatural tension and awareness we had felt, but words were inadequate. The man remained pale, his gaze still following subtle movements in the mist. I understood then that what had occurred could not be erased, only remembered. The ridge, the overgrown trail, the lingering mist, and the deliberate intelligence of the forest were all now part of our story. Even in ordinary sunlight, the forest's quiet vigilance persisted in memory. As I left the trailhead, I cast a final glance toward the ridge. The Smokies appeared ordinary, bathed in late afternoon light, yet I could still sense the patient, deliberate presence. The man had survived, but the forest had left its indelible impression on him, shaping his awareness in subtle, permanent ways. My own perception remained altered, attuned to every shadow, every shift of wind or mist. The ridge and the overgrown path had proven that horror in the Smokies is quiet, deliberate, and lingering. Back at home that night, the memory replayed in my mind, the mist curling through trees, the man's vacant gaze, the forest's deliberate patience. I realized that horror is not always loud or violent. It can be subtle, intelligent, and enduring. The ridge, the overgrown trail, the shadows, and the attention that followed us had left their mark. The Smokies are not simply beautiful wilderness. They are alive, aware, and capable of marking those who wander too far, teaching lessons that cannot be forgotten. Even days later, I hiked familiar trails differently. Every rustle, every curl of mist, every shifting shadow caught my attention in a new way. I understood now that some encounters in the Smokies are deliberate, calculated, and permanent. The ridge and its unseen intelligence had intertwined our experiences, leaving a subtle but undeniable imprint on our minds. Awareness had been measured and recorded, a quiet reminder that the forest watches patiently, its lessons precise and enduring. In the end, the forest did not need to chase or threaten to inspire fear. Its presence alone, patient and deliberate, had taught what needed to be learned. The ridge, the mist, the overgrown trail, and the man who had been marked all combined to leave a memory that was vivid, haunting, and permanent. The Smokies are not just mountains. They're sentient in ways subtle and unyielding, their lessons lingering long after the hiker has returned home. Story 4. Shadows on Roaring Fork. I had planned a solo hike along Roaring Fork, drawn by the promise of winding streams, moss-covered rocks, and ancient trees whose branches intertwined like cathedral arches. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet pine and decaying leaves, and the morning sunlight painted golden patches across the trail. Everything appeared ordinary, but as I ventured deeper, I felt a subtle tension beneath the beauty. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and every rustle of leaves seemed deliberate. Something in the Smokies was watching, patient and hidden. The trail narrowed quickly, roots and rocks forcing careful steps. Mist rose from the stream, curling around tree trunks in unusual patterns. My footsteps sounded louder than they should, snapping twigs and scattering leaves. I tried to dismiss the growing unease as imagination, but instinct tightened in my chest. The forest seemed aware of me in a way I couldn't explain, responsive, deliberate, almost intelligent. Each step felt measured, and I began to wonder if the trees themselves were observing, counting, testing. I reached a natural clearing beside the stream. The sunlight glinted off the water, and the gentle murmur of the creek should have calmed me. Instead, a subtle sensation prickled along my spine. Something had followed me. At first I thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer moving in the underbrush, but the sound of footsteps mirrored my own. Pausing when I paused and resuming with precise timing, rational thought failed to explain it. The forest had a rhythm, and it had measured me, responding to my every movement with careful observation. Further along, the trail wound through dense undergrowth. Fallen logs and twisted roots forced my attention, yet the unease persisted. I caught a glimpse of a figure in the fog, a human shape, pale and unmoving, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stopped, calling out softly, but but there was no response. My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed that I had intruded upon something patient and deliberate. The Smokies had a hidden intelligence, and I had stepped into its domain without realizing it. The trail began to climb steeply, and I noticed moss-covered tree stumps arranged in irregular intervals. Something about their placement felt intentional, a pattern that my mind couldn't fully grasp. I shivered, sensing the forest's awareness pressing closer, subtle but undeniable. Leaves rustled unnaturally, and the mist thickened around me, curling in slow, deliberate spirals. The air was charged, almost static, as though the forest itself exhaled and held its breath in turn, observing my hesitation, measuring my attention. After an hour, I came across a small, weathered cabin tucked behind a bend in the stream. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney, yet no one appeared outside. I approached cautiously, noting how the cabin's door faced the trail as if expecting a visitor. The silence was heavy, deliberate. I hesitated before stepping inside, but curiosity overcame fear. The interior was tidy: a rocking chair, shelves lined with supplies, a journal on the table. Everything seemed untouched by time, yet the air was dense, as if the cabin itself was aware of my presence. I picked up the journal and flipped through yellowed pages. Its entries chronicled a life lived in isolation, recording subtle shifts in the forests, patterns in the fog, and inexplicable occurrences. The writer had sensed the same vigilance I now felt, a patient, observing intelligence in the woods. Each word sent a shiver down my spine. The forest wasn't passive. It measured, responded, and recorded without ever revealing its full intent. I realized then that the Smokies could imprint themselves on those who strayed too far, leaving awareness altered in ways permanent and subtle. A faint tapping came at the window. My head snapped toward it, but no one was outside. I froze. The tapping paused when I stopped moving and resumed when I shifted. Rational thought offered no explanation. The rhythm matched my heartbeat, slow and precise. Stepped back, nearly tripping over the edge of the table. The forest had infiltrated the cabin itself, demonstrating its deliberate patience. Fear wrapped around me like the mist outside, heavy and unyielding, yet I could not look away. I left the cabin carefully, returning to the trail along the stream. The fog thickened, curling around tree trunks and boulders, and each footstep felt counted. Sunlight pierced occasional patches, but shadows lingered in impossible angles. The feeling of being followed persisted, subtle yet undeniable. It was not the work of wind or animals. It was deliberate, attentive, precise. The Smokies had claimed a piece of my awareness, and I felt its careful calculation pressing just behind me. Roots and rocks twisted beneath my feet, forcing me to maintain constant vigilance. Each misstep could have drawn attention. I paused by a particularly massive oak, its gnarled roots forming a natural barricade. Mist swirled around its trunk, and I noticed the way shadows shifted as I moved. The forest was patient, waiting, shaping my perception with subtle cues. Even the sounds of birds and water seemed orchestrated, part of a larger rhythm I could feel but not fully comprehend. By midday, the trail leveled near a small, open area. Sunlight warmed the clearing, ordinary hikers passing in the distance. Relief should have eased the tension, yet I remained alert. Every leaf, every movement in the mist, reminded me of the forest's quiet awareness. The cabin, the journal, the tapping, they had been deliberate, calculated to teach a lesson without overt confrontation. The Smokies' hidden intelligence lingered, shaping my experience and leaving a subtle but permanent mark. Finally, I reached a small junction where the trail returned to more traveled paths. Relief mingled with lingering tension. The forest behind me seemed ordinary once again, but instinct whispered that some of its awareness had followed me. My mind traced patterns I couldn't explain, subtle alignments in the roots, shadows, and moss. Even as ordinary hikers laughed and passed, I remained attuned to subtle cues, aware that the Smokies had shifted my perception and left me marked in ways I would carry forever. I paused at the trailhead, sunlight reflecting off rocks and water. The ridge behind me seemed calm, yet the forest's subtle, deliberate intelligence persisted in memory. Every instinct, every rustle of leaves, every curling mist had been deliberate. Even though the danger felt over, the forest's presence remained with me, patient and unyielding. I understood then that the Smokies could shape perception, observe carefully, and leave an indelible impression without ever revealing themselves. By late afternoon, I reached my car. The sunlight warmed my back, ordinary sounds filling the air, yet my mind remained attuned, replaying each step along the overgrown trail. Each precise tap at the cabin window, and each measured movement of the fog. The forest had been patient, deliberate, and invisible, imprinting awareness that could not be erased. The Smokies had delivered a lesson quietly, and it was one I would not forget. Even that night, lying in my cabin elsewhere, the memory lingered. I could almost feel the mist curling in the corners of my room, hear the faint tapping and rhythm with my pulse. Horror, I realized, need not roar to be profound. Its quiet presence, deliberate and attentive, was often more lasting. The forest had marked me, and the imprint would remain as long as I remembered the quiet patience of the Smokies and the overgrown trail that had taught me the weight of being observed. I resumed the trail, keeping my steps deliberate, wary of every shadow and swirl of mist. The forest seemed to follow me subtly, responding to my movements. Roots and rocks required careful attention, yet my senses were stretched beyond simple survival. Every sound, leaves, twigs, distant bird calls, felt amplified, deliberate, and observed. Realized that my hike was no longer ordinary. Smokies had claimed a part of my awareness, training me to notice the unseen rhythms of the forest. The stream beside the trail gurgled as I passed, yet the water seemed to move in unnatural patterns. Ripples shifted in ways that suggested intent. Shadows curled along the banks as if aware of my presence. I slowed, letting instinct guide me. The forest's patience was unnerving. It did not need to chase or attack. Its mere attention reshaped the experience, demanding that I move carefully, measured, aware of every microstep. Fear was no longer sharp. It had become a steady, constant pressure, reminding me of the forest's subtle dominance. I reached a clearing where the trail bent sharply. Sunlight pierced the canopy here, but the mist clung to the edges like smoke. I stopped, scanning the woods for signs of movement, but none appeared. Still, instinct told me I was being watched. The shadows shifted in precise ways, and the air itself seemed charged. I thought of the cabin, the journal, and the tapping, realizing that each event had been a test of observation. The forest's intelligence was not obvious, but it had guided my focus and reshaped my perception of every step. Further down, I stumbled upon an old footbridge crossing the stream. Its wooden planks creaked ominously beneath my weight. Pausing mid-bridge, I looked back toward the ridge, and a shiver ran through me. The forest above remained calm, ordinary in appearance, but I could feel its lingering attention pressing down. Every instinct was alert to subtle irregularities, the twist of a branch, the curl of mist, the precise timing of shadowed leaves. It was patient and deliberate, measuring me in silence. I continued, alert and wary. The trail widened slightly as it descended toward a more frequented path. Ordinary hikers appeared in the distance, their voices and laughter grounding me in reality, yet my mind remained tuned to subtleties, the way shadows clung unnaturally, how mist moved without wind, and how the air seemed aware. The forest's quiet intelligence had followed me from the cabin, imprinting a persistent awareness that I could not ignore. Its lesson was subtle, but undeniable. The Smokies measure and remember those who stray too far. Near the main trailhead, the forest opened into sunlight, ordinary and unthreatening. Relief washed over me, tempered by unease. Every leaf, shadow, and patch of mist replayed in my mind. I understood now that the Smokies' horror was not in violent or sudden acts, but in patient, deliberate observation. The forest itself was alive in ways I could sense but not fully comprehend. Its lessons were taught quietly, leaving impressions that would endure long after the hike was complete. The man who had previously been a shadow in the mist, if he was real, I could no longer be sure, was gone. But I could feel the forest's patience lingering in every root and boulder. The stream continued to babble, leaves rustled in the breeze, and sunlight played across rocks, yet I could not shake the subtle awareness the ridge had instilled in me. The Smokies had become a teacher, shaping perception with silence, shadows, and a precise attentiveness I would never forget. As I approached my car, ordinary sounds of hikers and rustling leaves were comforting, yet insufficient to dispel the forest's imprint. My pulse was steady, but the memory of mist curling unnaturally, the tapping, and the deliberate observation remained vivid. I understood now that fear in the Smokies is not always loud. It is often quiet, patient, and persistent. The forest watches, it waits. And those who wander too far carry its awareness forever. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, staring back at the trailhead. The ridge seemed ordinary now, bathed in sunlight, but the weight of observation lingered. Every instinct, every shadow, every shifting patch of mist reminded me that the Smokies have a quiet intelligence, subtle but unyielding. I realized that the forest's lesson had been precise. Survival is not always physical. Sometimes it is in awareness, attention, and respect for what cannot be seen. Driving away, I kept glancing at the ridge and the trail, half expecting a figure to appear, but the forest remained silent and still. I felt changed, tuned differently, aware in ways that ordinary hikers would never experience. The cabin, the journal, the precise tapping, they had been instruments of observation, and I had learned their lesson. The Smokies, patient and deliberate, had marked me, leaving awareness that would linger in memory, quiet but inescapable. By evening, I was home, the ordinary sounds of my neighborhood contrasting sharply with the attentive silence of roaring Fork. Yet sleep did not come easily. Every shadow in my room seemed to curl unnaturally. Every whisper of wind carried echoes of the forest's deliberate observation. The lesson remained clear. The Smokies are patient and intelligent, and those who enter their quiet corners are marked by awareness. Even in ordinary daylight, the ridge, the mist, and the cabin's subtle intelligence remained alive in my memory. The next day, I returned briefly to nearby trails, but the memory of Roaring Fork's deep, observant forest colored every step. Every rustle, every curl of mist, and every shadowed patch felt deliberate, as though I were being measured once again. I realized that the Smokies' influence was subtle but indelible, a quiet imprint of fear, attentiveness, and respect. I had survived, yet I was changed. The forest had watched, it had recorded, and it had remained patient, deliberate, and unforgettable. By the time the sun set, the memory had settled into me like a shadow I could not shake. I understood now that horror in the Smokies is often silent, precise, and enduring. The forest watches, and those who wander beyond the familiar trails carry its patient attention with them forever. The cabin, the journal, the tapping, and the deliberate observation had left their mark, not in terror, but in awareness. That awareness, quiet yet permanent, would remain long after the forest faded from view. Story 5. The Family in Cataloochee Valley. I went into the Cataloochee Valley because I wanted to be swallowed by the silence of the Great Smoky Mountains. Most tourists stay near the paved roads to watch the elk in the fields, but I had my sights set on the deep ridges. I carried a heavy pack and a sense of exhaustion that only the woods could fix. I didn't want to see a single person for at least 3 days, just the mist and the mountains. The first few miles were easy, following the old creek beds where the water runs cold and clear over gray stones. But as the afternoon started to fade, the air around me began to change in a way that made my skin crawl. The humidity in the Smokies usually feels like a warm blanket, but this felt like a physical weight. Every step I took required more effort, as if the forest itself was leaning against my chest. By the time the sun dipped behind the high peaks, a thick fog began to crawl out from between the trees like a living thing. It wasn't the thin, wispy mist you see in postcards. It was dense, heavy, and smelled strongly of wet earth and very old wood. I realized I had wandered off the main trail about an hour ago, following a path that wasn't marked on my GPS. I felt a sharp prickle on my neck. I decided to make camp before the light failed, but the ground was too steep and covered in jagged rocks. I kept walking, hoping to find a flat spot near the water, when the trees suddenly opened up into a small, hidden clearing. In the center sat a cabin built of massive gray logs that looked like they had grown out of the soil. The structure blended perfectly into the shadows, and there were no power lines or tire tracks anywhere. The cabin shouldn't have been there, and I knew the park maps well enough to know this area was supposed to be empty wilderness. As I stood at the edge of the tall grass, the front door creaked open just a few inches, revealing a deep black void inside. There was no light coming from within, and no smell of wood smoke, just a hollow darkness that seemed more dense than the night. I stood frozen, my heart thumping against my ribs. A man stepped out onto the porch, moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for someone of his size. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that were the exact shade of the forest floor, dull browns and dark greens. He didn't say a word at first, simply standing there with his long arms hanging at his sides, watching me. His eyes were wide and didn't seem to blink, reflecting the last bit of gray light like a pond. "I'm sorry to bother you. I didn't mean to trespass," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast silence. I got turned around and was looking for a place to pitch my tent before the fog got too thick. The man didn't move in response to my words, keeping his head tilted to the side as if he were listening to something else. I felt like a small animal caught in a bright light. "The valley is closed tonight," the man finally spoke, his voice low and rhythmic, like water moving over deep stones. "The mist is coming up from the ground, and it isn't safe for you to be out under the trees right now." He stepped down one of the porch stairs, and I realized he wasn't wearing any shoes. His feet were stained dark with soil and looked as tough and calloused as old leather. I wanted to turn around and run, but when I looked behind me, the fog had already swallowed the path I had used. It was a solid wall of white that felt like wet wool against my skin and muffled every sound from the forest. "You'd best come inside," the man said, gesturing toward the dark door. "My family is already waiting, and the forest doesn't like it when things are left out of place." The inside of the cabin smelled like crushed herbs, dried meat, and the cold scent of a deep cave. There was a single candle burning on a long wooden table, and around it sat a woman and 2 young children. They were all dressed in the same muted colors as the man, and none of them looked up when I entered, were sitting perfectly still, their hands flat on the wood, staring at nothing. The woman finally turned her head to look at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine that made my hands shake. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, yet her skin had a polished, smooth quality like a river stone. "Sit down, hiker," she whispered, her voice sounding like the rustle of dry corn stalks. "You are the first quiet one to wander this far in a long time. The valley decided to let you see us." I sat down at the end of the table, keeping my heavy backpack on because I felt like I might need to run. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, finally turned their heads in perfect unison to look at me. Their movements were not like human movements. They were slow and fluid, reminding me of a cat tracking a bird. I realized then that they weren't just a family. They were part of the roots in the dirt. "We watch the gates," the boy said suddenly, his voice high and clear, but completely devoid of any human warmth. "People come into these mountains thinking they can just take whatever they want without asking the valley for permission." He reached out and touched a small wooden figure on the table that looked exactly like me, down to my boots. "They bring their noise, and they disturb the peace we protect." A wooden bowl was pushed toward me, containing berries that were so dark they looked like polished black beads. "Eat these," the woman commanded, her eyes boring into mine as if she were searching for a secret. "You need the weight of the valley in your belly so that night wind doesn't carry you away to the bad places." I took a berry and ate it, finding it ice cold and tasting of iron and rain. The man sat at the head of the table and closed his eyes, tilting his chin upward as if catching a scent. "Listen to the floorboards," he whispered, and I found myself leaning forward, trying to hear whatever he heard. At first the cabin was silent, but then I felt a low thrumming vibrate through my boots. It sounded like a massive, slow heartbeat pulsing deep within the granite bedrock of the mountain. "The mountain is awake, and it knows you are sitting in this room," the woman said softly, walking a slow circle around the table. As she passed behind my chair, a wave of intense, bone-chilling cold washed over me, making my hair stand up. "It is deciding if you are a guest that deserves the morning, or if you are just more soil." I gripped the edge of the table, praying for the sun to rise. The man told me I could sleep in the corner on a pile of animal furs and dried moss. I didn't want to close my eyes, but a heavy, unnatural exhaustion began to pull at my eyelids like a physical weight. I lay down and stared up at the dark rafters, listening to the family move around in the near total darkness. They didn't speak English anymore. They made low clicking sounds and soft whistles. I must have lost consciousness, because I woke up to the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They weren't the sounds of a bear. They were the sounds of something massive, making the log walls tremble. Thump, thump. The creature walked around the perimeter over and over again, its weight so immense that I could hear the ground outside groaning and the stones shifting under its path. I sat up on the furs and saw the two children standing perfectly still by the front door, holding hands. The heavy footsteps outside stopped abruptly right on the other side of the wood, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, I heard a long, wet sniff. A sound like a giant bellows pulling in a rand. The door groaned as something leaned its weight against it from the outside. The man walked over to the door and placed his palm against the wood, beginning to hum a single low note. It was the same pitch as the vibration I had felt earlier, and as he hummed, the pressure on the door slowly began to ease. I heard the sound of something very large turning around and walking back into the trees. The man turned back to me, his face looking tired. It just wanted to know who you were. I spent the remaining hours of the night in a state of paralyzed terror, unable to move or look away from the shadows. I kept hearing things moving in the thick brush outside, sounds of heavy branches being snapped in a high-pitched, warbling cry. Every time I looked at the family, they were still wide awake, sitting in different parts of the room. They never seemed to eat or show any signs of fatigue. Around 3 a.m, the woman came over and sat on the floor right next to my head. "The valley has a very long memory, hiker," she said, her voice a tiny whisper that felt like it was inside my own skull. "It remembers every footstep of every person who has ever tried to claim these ridges. You have a quiet heart, which is the only reason the mountain hasn't claimed you tonight." I tried to ask her who they were, but she simply turned her head toward the frost-covered window. "We are the ones who were left behind when the world moved into the valleys and built its cities," she replied. "We are the ones who stay when the wind screams like a dying animal in the gaps. We are the ones who listen when the mountain speaks its true name to the sky." When the first light of dawn finally began to turn the windows gray, the oppressive atmosphere inside the cabin suddenly snapped. The heavy pressure in my chest vanished, and I felt as though I could finally take a full breath of air. I stood up, my joints feeling stiff and brittle as the family gathered by the front door. The man reached out and lifted the heavy wooden bar, swinging the door open. "The path is open for you now," the man said, pointing toward a narrow, moss-covered trail I hadn't noticed before. "Follow the creek down until you hit the old stone bridge near the park boundary, and do not stop for any reason. The valley is letting you leave with your life, but it is a heavy gift." I didn't stop to ask him what he meant. I grabbed my gear and stepped out. The clearing looked completely different in the morning light, with the grass glowing a vibrant green. I paused at the edge of the woods and looked back at the cabin, seeing the family still standing on the porch. They didn't wave or say anything, just stood there like 4 statues carved from gray wood, watching me go. I felt a primal urge to run as fast as I could. I hiked with a desperate energy, my legs burning with every step, and my lungs feeling like they were filled with hot coals. I followed the creek exactly as the man had instructed, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground to avoid looking into the deep woods. The forest felt quiet now, but it was the heavy, satisfied quiet of a predator. Every shadow looked like a thin man watching me pass. I found the old stone bridge within an hour, and as soon as my boots hit the gravel of the main road, I felt a release. It was like a heavy, freezing cloak had been lifted off my shoulders, and the world suddenly became loud and bright again. I looked down at my hands and realized I had been clenching them into fists so hard that my nails had left marks. I reached my truck and drove away as fast as I could, never once looking in the rearview mirror until I was miles away. I didn't stop until I reached a busy diner, where the smell of food and the sound of people talking felt like a lifeline. But as I sat there, I felt that weight the man had warned me about, a cold sensation telling me I wasn't the same. I haven't set foot in the Smokies since that night, and I don't think I ever will again. People always ask me why I stopped going into the woods, but I never tell them the truth because they wouldn't believe it. How do you explain that the forest is a living entity that has a family of guardians? All I know is that the silence is a mask, and I'm not going back. Story 6. The Elk Keeper. I have spent 5 years working as a seasonal ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. My main job is to watch the elk in the Cataloochee area during the busy summer months. Usually the work is quiet, and I enjoy being alone in the deep green forest. I track their movements and make sure tourists stay far away with their loud cameras. Lately, something in the woods has felt very different and very strange to me every single day. It started in late September, when the morning fog stays low in the valley for many hours. The mist was so thick I could barely see the large trees in front of my face. I was out near a field watching a group of cows and their young calves eat. The lead bull was standing very still and staring into the dark rhododendron bushes on the hill. He was not acting like he saw a bear. He looked like he saw a ghost. I looked through my heavy binoculars to see what was in the bushes, but nothing was there. The bull elk let out a sound I had never heard a wild animal make before. It sounded like a person crying or a long, low sob that hung in the cold air. All the other elk stopped eating and looked in the same direction at the same time. The silence in the valley became very heavy, and it was hard for me to breathe. I decided to move closer to see why the herd was acting so nervous and weird today. Stayed low in the tall, wet grass so the animals would not see me walk. As I moved, the air became very cold, and I could clearly see my own breath. The temperature was dropping much faster than it should for a sunny day in the park. The elk did not run away from me, which was a very bad sign for a ranger. Usually an elk will run if a person gets too close, but these animals were totally frozen. They were all staring at a spot in the mist that seemed to spin in circles. There was no wind, but the fog was moving on its own like a living creature. I saw a tall, thin shape starting to form out of the gray vapor right then. It was much taller than any man I have ever seen in my entire life on Earth. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just tired, but the shape did not go away at all. It did not have a face or clothes. It was just a tall, gray pillar of mist. The lead bull walked forward and lowered his head as if he were bowing to him. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach as I watched the bull. I realized the elk was not afraid. He was showing the thing a lot of respect. The air suddenly filled with a loud scratching noise like dry leaves on an old porch. I looked up and saw hundreds of black birds sitting in the trees in total silence. The shape in the mist began to glide toward the center of the elk herd. It moved in a strange way, like it was being pulled by invisible strings or wires. I stayed behind a rock, trying to keep my heart from beating too loud in me. I reached for my radio to call the main office, but it was not working anymore. When I pushed the button, I only heard a loud screeching noise in my right ear. My watch and my GPS unit also died at the exact same time that morning. I was cut off from everyone, trapped in a field with a presence I did not know. I stayed very flat on the ground and hoped the thing would not see me. The misty figure stopped in front of the bull and touched his flat brown forehead lightly. I watched as the elk closed his eyes and let out a soft, low hum. The creature seemed to be talking to the animals in a very secret and dark way. The fog around the figure turned a dark purple color in the bright morning light. I saw bright sparks of light dancing inside the chest of the tall, gray mist. I remembered an old legend about the elk keeper that the locals talked about for years. They said it was a spirit that watched over the herds at night in the valley. I always thought it was just a story to tell around a fire to kids. Seeing it now made me feel very small and afraid for my life and soul. This was not a friendly spirit. It was something cold from the mountain's deep heart. The creature turned its head toward me, and I felt a sharp pain in my brain. It knew I was watching, and it did not want me in the field today. I buried my face in the dirt and closed my eyes as tight as possible. The scratching noise grew much louder until it was the only sound I could hear. I felt like the mountain was screaming at me to leave this place right now. I felt a heavy weight on the ground right next to my head and neck. I looked up and saw the lead bull standing over me like a giant guard. He was not trying to hurt me, but he was blocking my way to run. He kept me pinned to the earth while the figure finished its work with them. The elk looked down at me and I felt a sense of deep sadness. I whispered an apology into the dirt because I felt like a thief in a church. I was caught by the owner of the woods in a forbidden place that day. The bull nudged my shoulder, and his skin felt like a block of cold ice. He stayed there for a long time, acting like a wall for my safety. I lay there in the cold grass and prayed for the morning sun to come. I could hear the other elk moving in a circle around the misty purple figure. Their hooves hit the dirt in a steady beat like a giant wooden drum beating. The fog became so thick I could not see more than 3 feet in front. The air smelled like wet fur and old electricity in the middle of the day. I felt like the world was changing into a place with no more people. Suddenly, the scratching noise stopped, and the valley became completely still and very quiet. I looked out and saw that the misty shape was gone from the field now. The purple light had vanished, and the fog was starting to lift away from me. Everything looked normal again, but I knew that what I saw was very real. The bull elk finally stepped away and let me stand up on my legs. The entire herd began to walk toward the high ridges and the dark, thick trees. They moved very fast and did not stop to eat any of the green grass. They vanished into the woods without looking back at me or the road once. I stood there for a long time trying to understand what happened this morning. I walked over to the spot where the spirit had stood to look for signs. There were no footprints, but the grass had turned a strange bone-white color there. When I touched a blade of grass, it crumbled into dust in my hand instantly. A large circle of dead plants marked the spot where the entity stood before. I felt very sick and had to lean against a tree nearby for a while. Life had been sucked out of the ground in that exact spot today. My radio started to work, and I heard the dispatcher calling my name over and over. She sounded bored, as if nothing had happened at all in the last long hour. She told me I was silent for 40 minutes and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but my voice was shaking very badly then. I did not tell her about the elk keeper or the dead grass. I spent the next few days looking for the herd, but they were all gone. I checked every field and water hole, but found no tracks or signs of life. It was like they were wiped off the map by the spirit in the mist. I started to have bad dreams every night about tall shapes walking in me. I could feel cold fingers touching my face while I tried to sleep alone. I asked an older ranger about the legend one day in the small gear shed, looked at me with a serious face, and told me to be very quiet. He said some things in the mountains are better left alone and forgotten now. He told me if I saw something, I should never talk about it again. He seemed very afraid even though we were in a bright, warm room. I realized then that many people had seen the figure in the morning mist. There was a secret among the rangers to pretend it was safe for people. We were there for the tourists, but the woods belonged to him and them. I started to look at the trees as a fence for a dark world. I did not want to be a ranger in the park anymore. The herd came back a week later, but they looked very sick and very old. Their fur was a dull gray, and they made no noise when they walked. They moved like ghosts through the grass and did not notice me at all. The tourists were afraid and stayed inside their cars with the windows up. The animals looked like they had seen the end of the world lately. I looked at the lead bull and saw his eyes were now a flat gray. He looked blind, but he still led the group with perfect, smooth movements. He was being guided by something I could not see or hear in the air. He looked toward me, and I felt that sharp brain pain again today. I knew right then I had to leave the park for good. I quit my job the next morning and packed my old truck very fast. My boss did not ask why I was leaving so fast in the week. I think he knew exactly what I saw in the deep, dark valley. I drove away from the mountains and did not look back in the mirror. I felt better in the city, but the fear stayed in my heart. Even now, I can feel the spirit in my mind when it is raining out. Whenever the mist rolls across the street, I look for tall shapes nearby. I cannot look at any wild animal without wondering who they are talking to. I know now that nature is not just a place to go play. It is a living thing that has its own dark, ancient secrets. I heard on the news that more hikers are missing in the park lately. Police say they got lost, but I know the truth of the woods. They probably walked into a clearing and saw the elk keeper that morning. They are part of the herd now, walking in the cold, white fog. The mountain takes what it wants and never gives it back to us. I wonder if the bull elk is still out there guarding the secret field. I wonder if he remembers me or the apology I said in the dirt. I hope he knows I was not trying to be his enemy then, but I know that animals do not think like we do about those things. He only cares about the spirit and the cold, purple light. The weight of the valley is a feeling that never leaves your soul. It feels like a layer of ice under your skin every single day. Every time I see the mountains, I see the dead white grass there. I see the face of a bull that saw a god in the fog. I am very glad that I am far away from it now. I stay inside most of the time with all the house lights on. I cannot stand the wind or the smell of rain on the grass. My friends think I am crazy, but they did not see the truth. They did not feel the heartbeat of the mountain against their own ribs. I know the truth, and that is enough for me to stay in. I am writing this so people know to be very careful in the woods. It is not always an accident when someone disappears in the tall trees. Sometimes, they are chosen by something older than any man alive right now. If you see the elk staring at nothing, just turn and run. Do not look back until you see the bright city lights again. Story 7. The Lost Trail. I need to post this here because if I don't tell someone, I think the dread will finally swallow me whole. I went hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains last week, looking for a quiet escape from the noise of the city. I am an experienced hiker who knows these woods well, or at least I thought I did before this trip. I found a small, unmarked trail near the parking lot and decided to see where it led for an hour. The air was perfectly still, and the sun was shining through the thick canopy of ancient trees as I started walking. The trail was narrow, but clear enough for me to follow without needing to look at my map or compass. I felt a sense of peace as I stepped over mossy rocks and listened to the distant sound of a creek. Everything seemed normal for the first mile, just a typical beautiful day in the national park forest. After about 20 minutes, I noticed that the sound of the birds had stopped completely, leaving the woods in total silence. I stopped walking and listened hard, but I could not hear any wind or even the rustle of a single leaf. It was like someone had pushed a mute button on the entire world, and it made the hair on my neck stand up. I checked my watch and realized that it had stopped moving at exactly 10 minutes past noon. I decided to turn around and head back to my truck because the silence was starting to make me feel very nervous. But when I turned around, the trail I had just walked on was gone, replaced by thick brush and tangled vines. I stood there for a minute, trying to understand how a well-worn path could simply vanish into the green earth like that. I started to feel a creeping dread in my chest that told me I was in deep trouble. The fog rolled in from nowhere, thick and white, like a heavy blanket that dropped the visibility down to almost nothing at all. I could barely see my own hands in front of my face as I tried to push through the heavy mountain laurel. Every direction looked exactly the same in the gray light, and I realized I was wandering aimlessly through the dense trees. I tried to stay calm and find a landmark, but the forest seemed to be shifting around me. I walked for what felt like hours, but I kept passing the same lightning-struck oak tree over and over again in the mist. And no matter which way I turned or how fast I walked, that twisted black trunk always appeared right in front of me. I felt like I was walking on a giant treadmill designed by something that wanted to keep me trapped in place. The dread was now a sharp pain in my stomach that made me want to scream for help. The shadows under the trees began to grow longer and move as if they had a life and a purpose of their own. Even though the sun was hidden by the fog, the darkness seemed to be leaking out from the cracks in the bark. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. I felt like something was following me just out of sight, waiting for me to finally give up. I started to run, pushing through the thorns that scratched my arms and tore at my expensive hiking clothes as I fled. My lungs burned with every breath of the cold, damp air, but I did not dare to slow down for a second. The trail suddenly appeared beneath my feet again, but it looked different, like it was made of dark, crushed bone instead. I followed it blindly because I didn't know what else to do in that terrifying and silent place. The trees on either side of the path began to lean in toward me, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers. I felt them brush against my shoulders, and the touch was as cold as a piece of ice from a winter stream. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that if I looked up, I would see something I couldn't forget. The forest felt alive and hungry, watching my every move with 1,000 invisible and hateful eyes. I found a small stone bridge crossing a dry creek bed that I definitely had not seen on my way into the woods. The stones were covered in a strange, glowing moss that pulsed with a faint and sickly green light in the dark. I crossed it quickly, but as soon as my boots hit the other side, the bridge crumbled into the deep sand. I was now truly cut off from the path behind me, trapped on a trail that led nowhere. Time began to distort in a way that made my head spin and my vision go blurry as I continued to walk. One minute the sky was a dim gray, and the next it was pitch black with stars that looked like tiny holes. I felt like I had been in the woods for days, but my stomach was not hungry and I wasn't thirsty. The only thing I felt was the heavy weight of the dread pressing down on my tired shoulders. I heard a voice calling my name from deep within the trees, a soft whisper that sounded exactly like my mother's voice. I almost ran toward it before I remembered that my mother has been dead for over 10 years now in the city. The voice started to laugh, a dry and raspy sound that echoed through the fog until it filled my whole head. I covered my ears and kept moving, refusing to look back at the shadows behind the trees. The trail led me to a small clearing where I saw a ranger outpost sitting perfectly still in the middle of the grass. It looked old and abandoned, with boards nailed over the windows and the front door hanging open by a single hinge. I felt a small spark of hope, thinking I might find a radio or at least a place to hide. I walked toward it, but the grass felt like it was trying to trip me. I stepped inside the cabin and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and something that smelled like rotting meat. There was a desk in the corner with a logbook lying open, its pages fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. I looked at the last entry and felt my blood turn to ice as I read my own name. It said I had checked in 50 years ago and never checked out of the park. I dropped the book and backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage. The walls of the cabin began to bleed a dark, oily substance that pooled on the wooden floor around my boots. I turned to run back out the door, but the opening was gone, replaced by a solid wall of rough logs. I was trapped inside the very place I thought would be my only way to safety. I felt a cold hand touch the back of my neck, and a voice whispered that I belonged to the mountain forest now. I spun around with my flashlight, but the room was empty, and the light was starting to flicker and die out. I began to kick at the walls, screaming at the top of my lungs for someone to come and save me. The cabin started to shrink, the ceiling lowering toward my head until I had to crouch down. Just as the darkness was about to swallow me, the front door suddenly reappeared, and I fell out onto the damp, cold grass. The cabin was gone, replaced by a circle of large gray stones that looked like they had been there forever. The fog was starting to lift, and I could see the faint glow of the sun rising over the ridge. I stood up and realized I was standing only 10 feet away from the main road. I ran toward the pavement, my boots pounding on the hard surface as if it were the most beautiful thing in the world. A car slowed down and the driver looked at me with a face full of confusion and a little bit of fear. I must have looked like a madman, covered in dirt and blood with my eyes wide and full of terror. He asked if I was okay, but I couldn't find the words to tell him. I got back to my truck and drove away as fast as I could, never once looking back at the trees in the mirror. When I got home, I looked in the mirror and saw that my hair had turned completely white in some places. There was a mark on my neck, a small bruise in the shape of a hand that would not go away. I felt like the forest had left a permanent stain on my soul that night. I haven't slept a full night since I came back from that trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park last week. Every time I close my eyes, I am back on that unmarked trail with the fog pressing in on my chest. I can still hear the voice of the mountain laughing at me from the shadows of my own dark bedroom. I know that I escaped the woods, but I don't think I ever really left them behind. I tried to tell my friends about it, but they just think I had a panic attack or got a little bit lost. They don't understand that the trail was not a real place, and the cabin was something much worse than wood. I see them looking at my white hair and the mark on my neck with a look of quiet pity. They think I am broken, and maybe they are right about that after what I saw there. I did some research online and found that dozens of people have gone missing in that exact area over the last 50 years. None of them were ever found. Not even a shoe or a scrap of clothing was left behind in the brush. I wonder if they are all still walking that endless trail in the fog, passing the same black oak tree. I wonder if they found the cabin and didn't get out in time like I did. The mark on my neck has started to itch and glow with a faint green light when the room gets very dark. I can feel something moving under my skin, like a small root growing deep into my muscles and my tired bones. I'm afraid to go to a doctor because I don't think they have a cure for a mountain curse. I feel like I am slowly turning into something that belongs to the trees and fog. I sold all of my hiking gear yesterday, throwing the boots and the backpack into the dumpster behind my apartment building in the city. I never want to see a trail or a forest again for as long as I am still drawing breath. I stay in the city where the lights are bright and the pavement is solid under my feet at night, but even here, I can smell the damp earth and the scent of rotting leaves. I woke up this morning and found a pile of wet, rotting leaves on my pillow, even though my bedroom door and windows are locked. They smell exactly like that cabin, and the cold coming off them is making my skin crawl. I tried to clean them up, but the damp stain on the fabric just keeps growing like a bruise. I don't think I'm alone in this apartment anymore. I can hear the scratching at my front door right now, the sound of dry branches rubbing against the wood in the hall. There is no tree outside my apartment, just a brick wall and a busy street full of loud cars. The fog is starting to leak in under the doorframe, thick and white and smelling of old bone. I know that my time is finally up, and the mountain has come to collect. My kitchen light just blew out, and the only thing I can see is the glow from my laptop screen on the wall. I'm typing this with shaking hands because the temperature in here just dropped until I can see my own breath. Don't go looking for the quiet spots off the main trails because that's where the air gets thick. Once you breathe it in, you belong to the mountain, and it will eventually come to collect. The shadow in the corner of my room is stretching out, and it has the shape of something with massive, jagged antlers. I can hear the sound of wet hooves clicking on my hardwood floor, coming closer to the bed every time I blink. I tried to stand up and run for the balcony, but my legs feel like they've been turned into lead. It's just standing there in the dark, waiting for the last of the light to die. The fog is pouring into my bedroom now, and it's so cold that it feels like my skin is starting to freeze. I can hear a low, vibrating hum coming from the chest of whatever is standing at the foot of my bed. If you're reading this, and you're planning a trip to the Smokies, stay on the asphalt, and don't get curious. That lost trail isn't a shortcut. It's a trap designed to peel you away from the world of people. Once the forest marks you, there isn't a lock or a wall in the city that can keep the fog out. Wish I had never stepped off the main path. Story 8. The Ridge Watcher. I don't care if people think I'm making this up for attention, because I know what I saw up on the Chilkoot Trail last Tuesday. It started as a simple solo hike to clear my head. Just me and a heavy pack heading toward the higher ridges. The weather was perfect when I set out, with clear skies and just enough of a breeze to keep the bugs off my neck. By the third hour, the silence of the high country started to feel less like peace and more like a weight. You expect noise in the woods like birds or the wind in the trees, but everything just stopped once I hit the rocky spine of the ridge. I stopped to take a drink, and that's when I got the first feeling that someone was standing directly behind me. I spun around fast, but there was nothing there except the gray shale and a few scrubby bushes clinging to the slope. I laughed it off as nerves, but the hair on my arms was standing straight up and wouldn't go back down. I started walking again. And that's when I heard the first distinct clack of a stone rolling down the cliff face about 50 feet above me. I looked up toward the peak and saw a flash of something dark moving behind a massive boulder near the summit. It wasn't the right color for a bear, and it moved way too fluidly to be a mountain goat or a sheep. It looked like a person in a heavy coat, but they were moving across terrain that would require a rope and a harness. I kept moving, trying to keep a steady pace while scanning the rocks above me every few seconds to see if they were still there. Every time I looked, I'd catch a tiny movement, a shadow shifting or a loose pebble tumbling down, but never a full view of the figure. They were keeping perfect pace with me, staying just out of sight behind the jagged edge of the ridgeline. The sun started to dip behind the peaks, and the temperature dropped so fast it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Knew I wasn't going to make it back to the trailhead before dark. I think the ridge was getting narrower and more dangerous with every step. I remembered seeing a small emergency shelter on the map about a mile ahead and pushed myself to reach it. The clacking sound followed me the whole way, sometimes getting closer and then drifting back into the distance. It sounded like someone was walking on the rocks with heavy boots, but they weren't making any effort to be quiet anymore. They wanted me to know they were up there, watching me struggle with my heavy pack as the light started to fail. I finally saw the outline of the cabin, a small A-frame made of dark timber and corrugated metal, tucked into a notch in the cliff. It looked solid and safe, which was exactly what I needed to stop the panic that was starting to bubble up in my chest. I scrambled toward the door, not even looking back at the ridge until I had the heavy bolt slid into place. The inside of the cabin was freezing and smelled like old dust and damp wood, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open slope. I dropped my pack and sat on the floor, listening to the wind start to howl through the gaps in the metal roofing. For about 10 minutes, it was completely quiet, and I actually started to think I was being paranoid. Then came the first tap on the roof, a light metallic tink like someone had dropped a small marble onto the corrugated steel. It happened again, then a third time, in a slow and rhythmic pattern that didn't sound like wind or falling ice. Someone was standing on the narrow ledge directly above the cabin, and they were dropping things onto the roof. I stood in the middle of the room with my bear spray in one hand and my folding knife in the other, staring at the ceiling. The tapping stopped and was replaced by a slow, heavy scraping sound, like a large body was being dragged across the metal. I could hear the roof plates groaning and shifting under a weight that had to be at least 200 pounds. "Who's out there?" I yelled, but my voice sounded thin and pathetic against the sound of the wind. There was no answer, just that relentless scraping as the weight moved from one side of the cabin roof to the other. I realized then that there was no way a human could have climbed down onto that roof without a ladder or a rope. I crawled over to the one tiny window on the side of the cabin and tried to see out into the darkness. The glass was old and distorted, but I could see a massive shadow draped over the edge of the roof, swaying back and forth in the wind. It looked like long, matted hair or thick rags hanging down, almost touching the ground outside the window. I backed away from the glass, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought I was going to throw up. Whatever was on the roof began to tap on the window pane now, a soft and rhythmic clicking of a fingernail against the glass. It wasn't trying to break in. It was just letting me know that it was still right there on the other side. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the corner with my back against the wall, watching that window until my eyes started to burn. The tapping on the glass never stopped, sometimes speeding up into a frantic blur and then slowing down to a single strike every minute. It was like it was playing a game with me, testing to see how long I could stay awake. Around 3 in the morning, the sound on the roof finally stopped and the weight shifted off the metal with a loud ringing bang. I heard the sound of something heavy landing in the dirt outside the door, followed by a long, low whistle that sounded almost human. It was a mournful, sliding note that stayed in the air long after the sound had actually finished. I pressed my ear to the heavy wooden door and held my breath, listening for any sign of movement on the porch. I could hear the sound of something sniffing at the base of the door, a deep and wet inhalation that sounded like a large animal. Then, the door handle began to turn slowly, the old metal creaking as the latch was tested from the outside. I leaned my entire weight against the door, even though the bolt was thrown, praying that the wood was strong enough to hold. The handle turned all the way down and then released with a snap, over and over again for what felt like hours. It was a calm, deliberate attempt to get inside, devoid of the frantic scratching you'd expect from a hungry predator. Eventually, the handle stopped moving, and the sniffing sound drifted away toward the back of the cabin. I heard the sound of heavy boots walking around the perimeter, the footsteps slow and heavy in the loose gravel. Every few steps, the thing would stop and tap 3 times on the wall, as if checking the thickness of the timber. I must have drifted off for a second because the next thing I knew, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding through the window. The cabin was silent, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had finally lifted from the room like a heavy fog. I sat there for another hour, too terrified to move, until the sun was high enough to light up the trail. I finally worked up the courage to slide the bolt back and crack the door open just an inch to peer outside. The porch was empty, and the ridge above the cabin looked as peaceful and desolate as it had the day before. I stepped out into the cold air, my knees shaking so badly I had to lean against the doorframe for support. I looked down at the dirt in front of the porch and saw a single set of tracks circling the entire cabin. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't paw prints. They looked like human feet, but the toes were far too long, and the arches were wrong. The tracks were deep, suggesting something incredibly heavy had been standing right where I was now. I looked up at the roof of the cabin and saw deep gouges in the metal roofing where something had clawed for grip. There were also dozens of small white stones scattered across the porch that hadn't been there when I arrived the night before. I picked one up and realized it wasn't a stone at all, but a piece of bleached, weathered bone. I didn't pack my gear. I just grabbed my keys and my bear spray and started running back down the trail toward my car. I didn't care about my expensive tent or my stove. I just needed to get off that ridge before the clouds rolled back in. I could feel eyes on me the whole way down, but I refused to look up at the peaks. I made it back to the trailhead in half the time it took to hike up. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. My truck was the only one in the lot, and I scrambled inside and locked the doors before I even put the keys in. I sat there for 20 minutes, just shaking and watching the ridge through the rearview mirror until my breath fogged the glass. The drive back to the city was a blur of dark pines and winding asphalt that seemed to stretch on forever. Every time a shadow crossed the road, I slammed on the brakes, expecting to see those long, distorted limbs blocking my path. I didn't feel safe until the streetlights of the suburbs finally replaced the oppressive darkness of the mountain pass. I've been back in my house for a week now, but the silence here feels different than it did before the hike. I spend my nights checking the window locks and staring at the tree line behind my backyard, waiting for a movement that shouldn't be there. Even with the heater on, I can still feel that high altitude chill deep inside my bones. Last night, I heard a light tapping on my bedroom window that matched the rhythm I heard in the emergency shelter. I refused to get up and look, keeping my eyes pressed shut until the sun finally broke through the curtains. I know there are no ledges outside my second-story window, but the sound of bone on glass was unmistakable. The local news mentioned a hiker went missing near the Chilcutt Ridge yesterday. They found nothing but an empty pack and a scattered gear. I sat in my kitchen and watched the report in silence, knowing exactly what kind of confusion the rangers would blame it on. The mountains are growing taller in my mind, a jagged wall that I will never attempt to climb again. I walked out to my porch this morning and found a single bleached fragment of bone sitting right on the welcome mat. I didn't pick it up or call the police. I just swept it into the bushes and went back inside to bolt the door. The Ridge Watcher doesn't need to be seen to be known, and I understand now that some debts are never truly settled. Story 9. The fog-bound cabin, the white wall of the storm, didn't roll in so much as it simply materialized, swallowing the valley in a matter of minutes. I had been making excellent time toward the high mountain pass, but suddenly I couldn't even see the tips of my own hiking boots against the gray earth. The air turned thick and wet, tasting of ozone and damp pine, as the temperature plummeted toward a deep freezing point. I knew better than to keep moving in whiteout conditions, especially with the steep drop-offs that lined the eastern side of the trail. I felt my way along the jagged rock face, my hands numb and stinging from the biting wind that howled through the narrow gap. Just as I was about to give up and huddle under my tarp, the outline of a roof appeared through the heavy, shifting mist. It was a small cabin built of heavy cedar logs that looked like they had been bleached white by decades of harsh mountain winters. The door was slightly ajar, creaking back and forth on rusted hinges that groaned with every sudden violent gust of the mountain gale. I didn't hesitate to push inside, desperate to escape the needles of ice that were now beginning to fall from the sky. The interior was remarkably dry, though. A layer of fine dust covered the single table and the two narrow bunks against the far wall. A cold hearth sat in the center of the room, still filled with gray ash that looked like it hadn't felt heat in many years. I dropped my pack and leaned against the door, finally feeling the adrenaline start to drain out of my tired system. As the storm outside intensified, the cabin began to settle, making various pops and groans that are common in these old timber structures. I started to unroll my sleeping bag, but a sharp, distinct thud from the crawl space beneath the floorboards made me freeze in place. It wasn't the sound of wood expanding, it was the heavy, muffled impact of something solid hitting the damp earth. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the thudding sound moved slowly from the left side of the cabin toward the right. It was a rhythmic, dragging noise, accompanied by a faint scraping that sounded like fingernails on the underside of the floor. There was no way a wild animal could get into a sealed foundation, yet the sound was unmistakably and terrifyingly deliberate. I pulled my knife from my belt and stood in the center of the room, my eyes darting between the narrow gaps in the floorboards. The scraping stopped directly beneath my feet, and for a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the wind outside the logs. Then, a soft, dry whisper drifted up through the cracks, a sound so quiet I thought I had imagined it. The whisper didn't sound like words so much as a long, drawn-out hiss that seemed to be mimicking the sound of the storm. I moved toward the bunks, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever was moving in the dark below the cabin. The air in the room started to feel heavy and stagnant, as if the fog from outside was leaking through the walls. I climbed onto the top bunk and pulled my knees to my chest, staring at the front door I had bolted just minutes before. A shadow flickered across the wall opposite me, a long and distorted shape that didn't match any of the furniture in the room. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, stretching upward until it touched the rafters of the dark timber ceiling. I looked toward the source of the shadow, but there was nothing there except the empty table and my own gear in the corner. The shape on the wall began to shrink and grow, dancing in the dim light of my headlamp as if it were breathing. I turned the light off, hoping the darkness would hide me, but the scratching beneath the floor immediately grew louder. The sound was now coming from the walls themselves, a frantic scuttling that moved upward toward the high roofline of the structure. It sounded like dozens of small, hard objects were being dragged across the cedar, moving too fast to be rats or squirrels. I could hear the timber groaning under the pressure of something heavy leaning against the exterior of the cabin, A heavy blow struck the door from the outside, making the entire frame shudder and sending a shower of dust from the ceiling. It wasn't the wind. It was a flat-handed strike that sounded like a person trying to see if the old wood would give way. I held my breath, waiting for a second strike, but the cabin went suddenly and completely silent. The silence was worse than the noise, a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring and my heart hammer against my ribs. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, my eyes straining to make out any detail in the pitch-black room. Then, I heard the sound of the door handle turning slowly, the old metal clicking as it reached the limit. The bolt held, but the handle continued to move up and down in a slow, patient cycle that never seemed to end. I could hear the wood of the door beginning to crack under a steady, mounting pressure from the other side of the cabin. Someone was leaning their full weight against the entrance, trying to force the latch through the frame without making a sound. I scrambled off the bunk and grabbed my pack, backing away toward the small window at the rear of the cabin. The glass was caked with grime and frost, but I could see a dark shape standing just inches away on the other side. It was a tall, thin figure wrapped in what looked like wet gray rags that blended perfectly with the shifting fog. The figure didn't have a face that I could see, just a smooth expanse of pale skin where the features should have been. It pressed its palms against the glass, the fingers long and spindly like the legs of a giant translucent spider. I realized then that the whispers hadn't been coming from the floor, but from the throat of this thing outside. I backed away from the window and toward the hearth, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped my knife on the floor. The scratching inside the walls resumed, more frantic now, as if the things inside were responding to the figure at the window. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a cage that was slowly being closed from the outside. I found a loose board near the back wall and pried it up, hoping to find a way out or a place to hide. Instead, I saw a crawl space filled with old yellowed bones that looked far too large to belong to any local wildlife. They were piled high in the dirt, neatly organized as if they had been placed there with great care over many years. I slammed the board back down and stood up, realizing that the inhabitants of this valley had been testing hikers for a long time. The door groaned again, and this time I heard the sound of the heavy iron bolt starting to bend under the strain. I knew that if that door opened, I wouldn't be leaving the valley when the storm finally cleared up. I lunged for the back window, smashing the glass with the butt of my knife and ignoring the way shards sliced my hands. The figure was gone from the glass, but I could see it moving through the fog toward the side of the building. I scrambled through the narrow opening and tumbled into the wet, freezing mud of the dark forest floor. I didn't look back to see if the door had finally given way. I just ran into the white wall of fog. The branches of the trees felt like fingers reaching out to grab my clothes and pull me back toward the cabin. I could hear the whistling hiss of the entities behind me, a sound that seemed to come from every direction. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and my legs gave out in a shallow ravine. I huddled under a fallen log, pulling my gray tarp over me and praying that my scent would be masked by the earth. The sound of heavy footsteps passed just feet away from my hiding spot, moving with a terrifying and steady confidence. The footsteps stopped, and I heard that same low whisper. This time much closer and filled with a strange clicking language. I stayed perfectly still, not even allowing myself to shiver as the cold seeped into my muscles and turned them to stone. The thing stayed there for a long time, its heavy breathing the only sound in the white void. Eventually, the sound of the footsteps drifted away, heading back toward the direction of the cabin and the high ridges. I stayed under that log for the rest of the night, watching the fog shift and swirl in the moonlight like a living creature. I didn't move a single muscle until the first orange light of dawn touched the trees. The storm had passed, leaving the valley draped in a layer of frost that made every branch look like it was made of glass. I climbed out from under the log and began the long trek back toward the main trail, my body aching. I didn't look back at the valley even once, fearing I would see that white cabin watching me still. I reached the trailhead by noon, my clothes torn, and my gear half ruined from the flight through the thick, tangled brush. There were other hikers there, laughing and loading their packs as if the world were a safe and predictable place. I couldn't bring myself to speak to them, feeling like a ghost that had wandered back from a void. I drove home in a daze, the sound of the scratching walls still echoing in the quiet cabin of my truck. Every time I passed a stand of trees, I expected to see those pale, spindly fingers reaching out from the shadows. The safety of my house felt thin and artificial, a temporary illusion that could be shattered at any moment by a whisper. I've spent the last 3 nights staring at the door of my own bedroom, waiting for the handle to turn in that cycle. I know that the things in the fog don't care about distance, and that once you've stepped inside, you never leave. The bone-white timber of that cabin is burned into my mind like a brand I can't remove. I saw a news report this morning about a hiker who went missing in that same valley, and they found abandoned gear. They didn't mention a cabin, and when I checked the maps again, there was no record of any structure ever being built. It was a place meant only for those the forest decided to keep for its own dark purposes. I've sold all my gear, and I don't think I'll ever set foot in a forest again for as long as I live. The silence of the city is loud enough to drown out the memory of those whispers, but I still feel the fog. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some valleys are better left to the things that breathe. Story 10. The Mountain Watch. The porch boards of our family cabin have a specific, heavy groan that only happens when something significantly larger than a bobcat or a stray dog steps on them. I was sitting by the wood stove, sharpening my heavy skinning knife, when that low, rhythmic wood stress pulled my eyes toward the heavy oak door. My father didn't even look up from the rifle he was cleaning, but I saw his hand tighten instinctively around the walnut stock of his weapon. It was well past midnight, and the high Smokies don't offer much hospitality to anyone wandering the ridges after the sun goes down in the valley. We live 3 miles from the nearest fire road, tucked into a deep notch where the fog stays trapped even in the heat of July. A second step followed the first, and a slow, dragging sound that suggested whoever was out there was either badly hurt or incredibly tired from the climb. My father stood up, his movements fluid and silent as he moved to the small window to peer through the thick, distorted glass pane of the cabin. He didn't say a word, but the way his jaw set told me that whatever he saw wasn't a neighbor coming to trade supplies. I set my knife down and reached for the heavy iron poker near the hearth, feeling the sudden, unnatural chill of the mountain room seep into my boots. "Open the door, Caleb," my father whispered, his voice as dry as the dead leaves that were currently swirling against the cabin walls in the wind. I moved to the heavy bolt, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to find a way out of a cage. I slowly slid the cold metal back and pulled, expecting a rush of mountain air and the sight of a desperate, lost, and confused hiker. The man standing on our porch wasn't just desperate. He was completely hollowed out, his expensive hiking gear shredded into thin, salt-stained ribbons of useless nylon. His eyes were wide and fixed on something miles behind me, reflecting the orange glow of our fire with a terrifying, glassy intensity. He didn't move to come inside. He just stood there shivering while the mountain wind whipped his matted hair into his pale, gaunt face. "Help him in," my father commanded, though he kept the rifle held loosely across his chest as he stepped back into the shadows of the room. I reached out and grabbed the man's arm, but his skin felt like it had been dipped in the freezing waters of the creek. He stumbled over the threshold, his boots leaving thick smears of black, foul-smelling mud across our clean, hand-scrubbed pine floorboards in the kitchen area. We sat him down in the heavy rocking chair by the fire, and I wrapped a thick wool blanket around his trembling skeletal shoulders for warmth. He didn't acknowledge the heat or the fact that he was finally out of the oppressive darkness of the high forest ridges. He just stared at the flickering flames, his mouth moving in a silent, frantic conversation with someone who wasn't actually visible in the room. I brought him a tin cup of black coffee, but when I tried to hand it to him, his hand clamped onto my wrist with immense strength. His grip was unnaturally strong, the fingers feeling like iron bands that were trying to crush the bone beneath my skin. He looked up at me then, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that his pupils were completely and unnervingly blown out to the edges. "It followed the light," the man whispered, his voice sounding like 2 dry stones being rubbed together in the bottom of a deep, dark well. Wasn't looking at me, but at the reflection of the cabin windows and the polished surface of the coffee pot. I pulled my arm back, but he didn't let go, his gaze moving frantically around the ceiling of our home as if searching for a way out. My father stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle lowering just an inch as he looked the stranger up and down with deep, growing suspicion. "What followed you, son?" he asked, his voice steady but lacking any of the warmth a lost traveler might usually expect from us. The man didn't answer right away, his head tilting to the side as if he were listening to a distant, high-pitched, and haunting mountain sound. Outside, the forest went suddenly and completely silent, the kind of quiet that usually precedes a massive storm or a predator's final strike on its prey. The crickets stopped, The wind died down to a whisper, and even the owls seemed to hold their breath in the trees. The man in the chair began to hum a low, vibrating note that resonated deep within the floorboards and my own heavy chest. "The watcher on the ridge," the stranger finally said, his grip on my wrist loosening just enough for me to scramble away from his reach. He began to rock back and forth, the heavy chair creaking in a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock. "It doesn't like the walls, but it likes the heat, and it wants to see how the fire tastes in the dark of night." My father moved to the door and slid the bolt back into place, his eyes never leaving the dark woods visible through the small window. He knew these mountains better than any man alive, but I saw a flicker of genuine doubt cross his weathered face tonight. He began to blow out the lanterns, one by one, until the only light left was the dying fire in the hearth's glowing center. "We shouldn't have let him in, Caleb," my father muttered, his voice so low that I almost didn't hear it over the man's constant humming. The hiker was now clawing at his own chest, his fingernails leaving long, red gouges in the skin above his tattered thermal shirt. He seemed to be trying to peel something off himself, something that none of us could actually see or touch in the dim light. A heavy thud echoed from the roof, followed by the sound of something large and solid being dragged across the cedar shingles above our heads. It wasn't a bear, because the weight was distributed in a way that suggested 2 legs rather than 4, moving with purpose. The hiker stopped humming and looked up at the ceiling, a wide and terrifying grin spreading across his gaunt, pale face in the shadows. "It's hungry," the man giggled, a sound so out of place in our quiet cabin that it made the hair on my neck rise in fear. He stood up suddenly, the wool blanket falling to the floor like a discarded skin as he moved toward the kitchen. My father raised the rifle, but the man didn't seem to care about the weapon or the threat it represented to his life at all. He began to throw our winter supplies onto the floor, tearing open bags of flour and smashing jars of preserved peaches against the wood. It wasn't a search for food, it was a deliberate act of destruction, as if he were trying to clear a path. He was whispering to the shadows in the corner, his words a jumbled mess of Latin and old mountain dialect that made no sense. The scratching on the roof intensified, and I heard the sound of the chimney stones shifting under an immense, mounting pressure from the outside world. Something was trying to climb down the flue, pushing against the heavy iron damper that I had closed earlier in the evening. The hiker stood beneath the hearth, his arms outstretched as if he were waiting for a dark, twisted, and ancient blessing to descend. "Get back from there," my father roared, grabbing the man by the collar and throwing him across the room with surprising force. The stranger hit the wall and slumped down, but he continued to laugh, the sound bubbling up through his throat like stagnant water. He looked at the door, and I saw the heavy oak planks begin to bow inward, quite slowly under a massive weight. Whatever was outside was leaning its full weight against our home, the wood groaning and splintering under the force of the unseen visitor. I grabbed the heavy iron poker again, standing beside my father as we watched the doorframe begin to pull away. The hiker crawled toward the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the widening gap in the splintering and cracking wood. "Let it in, let it in, let it in," the man chanted, his voice rising in volume until he was screaming the words at us. My father didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the boom of the rifle deafening in the small, cramped space. The scratching on the roof stopped instantly, and for a second, the pressure on the door vanished completely, as if it never existed. The hiker fell silent, his body going limp, as if the string holding him up had been suddenly and violently cut by a knife. We stood there in the sulphurous smoke of the rifle fire, waiting for the next attack, but the forest remained deathly quiet. My father moved to the hiker and checked his pulse, but he shook his head slowly and solemnly in the dying firelight. "He's gone, Caleb," my father said, his voice heavy with a weariness that I had never heard in all my 20 years of life. The man's heart had simply stopped beating, as if the fear or the presence in the woods had finally taken everything he had. It didn't move the body, choosing instead to stay huddled by the hearth until the first light of dawn finally arrived on the ridge. When the sun finally rose above the ridges, the cabin felt cold and empty, the smell of the stranger's mud still lingering in the air. We opened the door and found the porch covered in deep, jagged gouges that looked like they were made by a claw. There were no tracks leading away from the cabin, only a wide circle of pressed-down dead grass in the clearing. We carried the hiker's body down to the valley and left it near the ranger station, not wanting to explain the events to anyone. My father didn't speak the entire way back up the mountain, his eyes constantly scanning the high ridges above the trail. I knew he was looking for a shadow that didn't belong, a shape that stayed in the deep, dark gaps of the pines. We spent the next 3 days reinforcing the cabin door with heavy iron straps and clearing the brush back 50 feet from the walls. I don't sit by the fire anymore without my rifle within reach, and I never leave the cabin after the sun sets. The mountain has a long memory, and I know that the Watcher hasn't forgotten the taste of our warm human heat. I found a small, carved piece of wood on my windowsill yesterday morning, shaped like a human heart, but smooth as a river stone. I didn't show it to my father. I just threw it into the wood stove and watched it turn into gray, lifeless ash. I know it was a gift, or perhaps a warning, from the thing that lives in the high, swirling, and cold fog. My father has started talking in his sleep, his voice a low and guttural hiss that sounds exactly like the hiker we left at the ranger station. He talks about the ridges and the way the trees move when no one is looking, his eyes darting under his lids. I fear that the visitor didn't just bring himself into our home that night in the middle of the mountain storm. The neighbors from the lower valley stopped coming by to trade, claiming that the air around our notch has turned sour and cold lately. I can't blame them, because I feel it too, a heavy, oily presence that seems to coat everything we touch or eat. We are becoming part of the ridge, slowly fading into the same gray shadows as the ancient, rotting and dead trees. I'm sitting here now, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, and I can already hear the first rhythmic groan of the porch boards. I won't open the door tonight, and I won't reach for the light because I know what's waiting in the dark. The mountain watch never truly ends, once you've looked into the eyes of the thing that follows the light home. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more strange explorations. See you next time.